For the last few weeks, we have watched with dismay as Russia invaded Ukraine and has proceeded to violate every law and convention of war in its effort to take over that country, and which looks like being ultimately successful. And while strictly not a Jewish issue per se, there are indeed some factors, such as Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky being openly Jewish, and the fact that Israel and the diaspora mobilised quickly and effectively to rescue thousands of Ukrainian Jews and get them to Israel, or at least out of Ukraine. Again, proving that it is a light unto the nations, Israel is now planning to establish a field hospital in western Ukraine. But I am deeply troubled by the reaction of the West, most notably how its leaders, the United States and Europe, have unashamedly surrendered all defence of Western values and have essentially abandoned the Ukrainians to fend for themselves. Yes, there have been some shipments of weapons to Ukraine, but too little and with no real commitment to support this democratic nation in its fight against an authoritarian invader. And the most significant abandonment comes from America, where President Joe Biden has been perfectly happy to sit back and watch from the sidelines. All he has done is offer his prayers, his support, and imposed financial sanctions on Russia, which, whilst they may be somewhat effective in the longer term, won't help right now as Ukrainian cities are being reduced to rubble and its civilians massacred. The real issue here is that the woke West is no longer prepared to defend its values, and in fact doesn't even know what they are anymore and why they are worth defending. In schools, the study of history, which helps avoid the mistakes of the past, has now been downgraded and replaced with things like gender and climate change subjects. The woke generation is oblivious to the fact that all the freedoms and lifestyle privileges that they take for granted were only achieved after centuries of struggles, suffering and wars. The reason they must be valued and defended is because they can so easily be lost. From a Jewish perspective, we have heard how Ukraine has had a long history of anti-Semitism, sympathising with Nazi Germany during the war, and even taking delight in committing atrocities of its own against the Jews during the Holocaust. Then we hear how Ukraine has never voted in support of Israel at the United Nations, abstaining at times and voting directly against Israel at other times. See, people say, the karma bus has come and the Ukrainians somehow deserve what's coming to them. Well, those arguments don't wash with me. This war has nothing to do with Ukraine and everything to do with a maniacal dictator hell-bent on bombing a neighbouring country out of existence to gain control of its territory. The Ukrainians are begging the West for tangible support against this tyranny, but our leaders have proven spineless. The United States and NATO says it is fearful of an escalation, but doesn't realise that doing nothing now will simply result in more casualties later. I don't know at this point if World War III has indeed begun, but it is not hard to see Russia, China and Iran being crazy enough to unite against the West. But I do know that the West should be utterly ashamed of itself, and none of this would have happened under a Trump presidency. If there is one positive to come out of all this, it is that Israel can now see exactly where the world stands. Remember Barack Obama's infamous line that America will always have Israel's back. Well, who believes that now? In fact, we can see exactly how much of a friend the West will be, and when the time comes to do something about Iran, be it sooner or later, Israel knows exactly who it can rely on. Precisely no one. But in Israel, I'm sure that this is one history lesson that will not be overlooked. This is Alan Friedman for the Australian Jewish Association.